They say silence keeps you safe, but silence nearly erased me. My own father ordered me to stay invisible, mocking me as if I were worthless. But silence isn't weakness. It's the seed of brutal revenge. Silent revenge grows in the shadows until justice revenge explodes in daylight. And the first crack in his empire began the night the general spoke only to me. My name is Elena Ward. I'm 36 years old, a major in Army intelligence, trained to read the spaces between words where most people never look. That night at Pearl Harbor, I wasn't invited to shine. I was brought along the way you carry a spare part. Useful if something breaks, but never meant to be seen. My father, General Marcus Ward, leaned toward me as the doors swung open and told me in a clipped whisper, "Stay quiet. You're here to observe. Nothing more." I nodded once, not because I agreed, but because I'd learned the cost of showing defiance too early. You want to know humiliation? Try standing in a hall of power where every ribbon, every polished shoe, every glass raised is meant to signal authority, and realize the man who should be your advocate just erased you with 6 words. Stay quiet. Observe. Nothing more. He thought those words would bury me. The ballroom burned with light so sharp it felt surgical. Red and gold banners hung like painted promises above our heads. Crystal chandeliers dripped sparks over uniforms stiff with pride. And me, I was pinned to the wall, a ghost in dress blues, spine straight, face unreadable, invisible. That's the trick about humiliation. It doesn't always come from public ridicule. Sometimes it's the private knife only you can feel. Then General Liu stepped forward, a man whose name carried weight like a hammer, former head of cyber intelligence, war historian, the kind of opponent who didn't waste words. He opened his mouth, and what came out wasn't Mandarin, wasn't English, wasn't anything the polished translators were ready for. It was a dialect buried in the mountains of Tibet and Sichuan, a raw cadence shaped by stone valleys and old prayers. The official interpreter froze, his lips parted, no sound emerging. The silence spread like fire in dry grass. My father leaned forward, his jaw set, waiting for the man to recover. But nothing came. No translation, no rescue, just that heavy, suffocating pause. And in that moment, I felt every eye in the room searching for meaning, for a lifeline. I knew the dialect. I had studied it not in classrooms but in forgotten villages, from the mouths of people who carved their lives into the earth. And I knew exactly what would happen if no one understood Lou's words. Insult, chaos, maybe worse. So I moved. One step, then another, heels sharp against marble. My father's head snapped toward me, fury tightening his face. "Elena, don't," he hissed, low enough to vanish under the chandeliers. I didn't stop. I met the general's eyes and bowed slightly. "Honored General," I said in his dialect, my voice clean, precise, unshaken. "Forgive the delay. If you permit, I will translate." The air collapsed into stillness. Lou studied me, then nodded once, and with that, he said words that cut the room in half. "From this moment forward, I will speak only to her." Every officer, every diplomat, every camera turned, and I watched the power drain from my father's face. The crown he'd worn for decades slid into my hands, not because I demanded it, but because I stepped forward when everyone else stayed frozen. You're watching Hidden Vengeance, where silent scars become sharp weapons and betrayal is answered with justice. If you crave stories of brutal reversals and cold, calculated revenge, make sure you like this video and subscribe. Every story here is proof that silence is never weakness. It's the sharpest edge of all. That night, as I stood one step behind General Liu, translating every word with exact precision, I knew nothing would ever be the same. My father's silence had protected him for years. But now, silence belonged to me. And this was only the first strike. He thought one moment of recognition was all I'd claim, but he hadn't yet seen what I was willing to uncover next. When the applause finally died down that night, I carried something heavier than pride. My father's face, stiff and unreadable, stayed etched in my mind. But I knew the truth. That humiliation had been years in the making. It didn't start under chandeliers. It started the day my brother never came home. Caleb was 5 years older than me, fearless, decisive, the kind of soldier commanders love to parade in front of cadets. In 2007, a bullet cut him down in Afghanistan, and from that moment on, my father built a fortress of order around his grief. He polished that pain into medals, schedules, and a belief that only men like Caleb could embody strength. I was something different, and to him, different meant disposable. At first, I mistook his coldness for mourning. A missed call here, a curt reply there. Silence stretched so tight it almost snapped. But slowly, the pattern revealed itself. Every time my reports reached his desk, they vanished into thin air. Files stamped internal only when they contained breakthroughs no one else had caught. Commendations delayed, then dismissed. And always that line I'd memorized like scripture. Not suitable for command. He never said it to my face, but his actions carved it into my record. Imagine pouring months into decrypting signals across the 38th parallel, exposing a hybrid code that could confuse entire battalions, only to watch your analysis vanish from the review board without a trace. I remember sitting in the comm center, screen glowing in the dim light, scrolling through the audit logs. One click after another, the evidence unfolded. My report hadn't been misfiled. It had been archived manually. Clearance level 5. That narrowed it to 5 officers. I cross-checked the patterns. 4 were consistent. 1 wasn't. My father. I didn't slam the desk. I didn't storm his office. Instead, I printed the metadata, slid it into a slim navy folder, and locked it in my drawer. That folder grew, piece by piece, a quiet collection of erasures, a disappearing evaluation here, a rescinded promotion there. Each page was like a cut you don't notice until you're bleeding. He thought his silence would erase me, but I was cataloging every wound. The more proficient I became, the languages, the codes, the dialects no machine could parse, the further he pulled away. It was almost surgical. At family dinners, he'd speak of Caleb as though I were furniture. In meetings, he'd interrupt before I finished a sentence. Once, after I translated a rare Lao dialect in seconds, he leaned in and said, "Sharp work. Different from your brother, but sharp." That word, different, wasn't praise. It was a verdict. He was making sure no one ever mistook me for his heir. And still, I didn't break. I observed. I waited. Because if there's one thing I learned from years of listening to dialects most people mistake for noise, it's this. Silence always leaves patterns. All you need is the patience to hear them. If you've ever felt the weight of being overlooked, of having your victories erased before they reach the light, then you know this story isn't just mine. It belongs to anyone who's had to fight for recognition in a room built to ignore them. That's why I need you to share this video, because every story like mine reminds someone else they're not alone in that silence. One night in the base library, long after everyone else had gone, I stared at my record on the terminal. There it was, my father's initials beside a line that read, "Linguistic excellence, limited suitability for battlefield command." I sat motionless for 23 minutes, watching the cursor blink like a slow heartbeat. And in that rhythm, I felt something shift. Not rage, not despair. Clarity. Clarity that his silence wasn't grief anymore. It was design. A design meant to keep me small, to keep Caleb's shadow larger than my existence, to guard his narrative even if it meant suffocating mine. but designs crack, patterns betray their makers, and I knew sooner or later there would come a moment where all those buried truths would have to surface. The only question was whether I'd be ready when the silence finally broke. I didn't know the moment would arrive so suddenly. One late evening, when the room was still and the base corridors echoed like empty vaults, I pressed play on an audio file, and the voice that filled my ears wasn't an enemy's. It was my father's. And he said words I can never unhear. The audio file was small, barely 12 minutes long, but it detonated like a charge inside my chest. I listened once, then again, forcing myself not to flinch as the words settled into me. It was his voice, calm, deliberate, the same tone he used in mission briefings. "She's good, I'll admit that," he said, pausing long enough to make me believe for half a second I might finally hear pride. But then came the knife. "I can't let her stand above me. Not my own daughter." I sat frozen in that sterile comms room, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead like an interrogation lamp. The cursor blinked on the playback screen, a relentless reminder that those words were not imagined. I closed my eyes and saw his face, the measured expression he wore at every debrief, at every family dinner where he praised Caleb's courage and dismissed my work as academic. Now the mask was gone, and I was hearing the unfiltered truth. He hadn't just tried to contain me. He had vowed to bury me. The next morning, I walked into the command center with my uniform pressed sharp, my hair tied back so tightly it pulled at the skin. To anyone else, I looked composed. But inside, every step felt like walking across glass. Officers nodded, unaware that the world had just tilted. My father's voice still echoed in my ears, cutting through the air with surgical precision. Not my own daughter. I didn't confront him. I didn't slam the recording on the table. Instead, I did what I'd been trained to do: observe, gather, wait. I printed transcripts, secured metadata, traced authorization logs. Each piece fit into the folder I'd been building for months, the Navy one locked in my drawer. It was no longer a file, it was a weapon. But even weapons need timing. I watched him in meetings, watched how he controlled the room with pauses, how junior officers straightened under his gaze, how the silence bent to his will. And I realized something chilling. For years, I thought silence was his fortress. But now, silence had become his blind spot. He never expected mine to cut deeper. Every erased report, every promotion blocked, every time he brushed me aside with that word different, they were no longer wounds. They were exhibits. I didn't have to shout. I didn't have to fight in the open. All I had to do was hold my line until the cracks in his legacy widened enough for the truth to pour through. And that's the heart of silent revenge. It's not rage. It's not fire. It's patience sharpened into a blade. If you've ever been silenced, erased, told you were not enough, then you understand why I refuse to break. And if this story strikes something inside you, share it. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, because every time one of us speaks the truth out loud, we weaken the walls built to contain us. Weeks passed, and the tension grew heavier, coiled around me like wire. Whispers began, other women whose records bore the same mysterious gaps, the same erased commendations. One by one they reached out, not loudly, but quietly, in the way survivors recognize each other. My story was no longer mine alone. The silence had multiplied. And when silence multiplies, it becomes a force that even generals cannot contain. But I knew it wasn't enough to collect whispers. At some point, the blade had to strike. And when it did, it wouldn't be in the shadows. It would be in a room where the whole world would have to watch what silence had built and what silence would destroy. The day that reckoning arrived, I walked into a chamber lined with polished wood and brass, a place where reputations were meant to be untouchable, and I carried with me the one piece of proof that could bring my father's empire crashing down. The chamber was colder than the rest of the building, though the walls gleamed with polished wood and brass plates that whispered power. I sat at the long table, spine straight, uniform immaculate, the navy folder resting at my fingertips. Across from me sat men and women whose names had shaped policies for decades, and beside them, my father. He didn't look at me, not once. His gaze stayed pinned to the far wall, as if ignoring me might still erase me. The proceedings opened with the measured cadence of protocol. Questions delivered in clipped tones, legal language stacked like sandbags. But beneath it all, the air carried a charge, the kind that hums before a storm breaks. I waited, calm, controlled, every breath tethered to a rhythm I'd practiced in silence. My weapon wasn't anger, it was precision. When the panel asked for supporting evidence, I slid the folder forward with steady hands. Pages fanned open, transcripts, logs, records of commendations that had been mysteriously delayed, reports pulled from circulation just short of review. Their eyes scanned the data, brows tightening, jaws locking. Then came the audio file. The room went still as the playback began. My father's voice filled the air, deep, composed, every syllable echoing with authority, until the words themselves cut that authority apart. She's good. I'll admit that. But I can't let her stand above me, not my own daughter. Silence followed. Not respectful silence, not procedural silence. The kind of silence that presses on your lungs, that leaves no place to hide. One of the colonels dropped his pen. Another leaned back slowly, his chair groaning under the weight of what they'd just heard. My father's hands, clasped on the table, tightened until the knuckles whitened. For the first time in my life, I saw him falter. I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on the panel, on the evidence laid bare under fluorescent lights. Let them measure him against his own words. Let them see the pattern that I had lived with in silence. The head of the panel cleared his throat, but the usual composure had cracked. "General Quinn," he said, voice careful, "do you deny the authenticity of this recording?" A long pause stretched out, endless and suffocating. My father lifted his chin, still refusing to look at me. His reply was almost a whisper, yet it carried more weight than a shout. No. That single word detonated louder than any gavel. No defense, no spin, no excuse. Just an admission carved into the air. The panel members exchanged glances, the unspoken verdict already passing between them. And in that moment I felt something shift. Not victory, not triumph, but the quiet collapse of a fortress that had stood for decades. For years, he had erased me. Now, the record was indelible. His legacy, once untouchable, cracked under the weight of proof he couldn't bury. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I sat still, steady, letting the silence do what it had never done before: speak for me. When the session adjourned, I gathered my folder and stood. My father remained seated, eyes fixed on nothing, a man who had finally been outrun by his own blood. The brass gleamed around him, but it no longer reflected power. It reflected ruin. And I walked out without a word, heels striking marble like a drumbeat, each step carrying me further from his shadow. But legacies don't fall in one moment. They unravel, thread by thread. And sometimes the greatest shock comes not from the admission of guilt, but from the reckoning that follows, when silence gives way to a flood no one can control. His resignation didn't come with ceremony. No flag folded, no speeches, no brass band playing a final march. Just a single page signed in black ink, slipped across a polished desk, initials scrawled like a quiet surrender. Within 48 hours, his office was cleared, the nameplate removed, and the man who once commanded silence in every room walked out without applause. That was how his empire ended. Not in fire, but in the soundless collapse of a story he could no longer control. I didn't feel triumph, not the kind that surges hot in the chest. What I felt was colder, heavier, like standing in the wreckage of a fortress and realizing the walls had been holding you in as much as keeping others out. For years he had erased me with a pen stroke, with a nod, with 6 clipped words. Now, the eraser had turned against him. The aftermath unfolded in ripples. Officers who once looked through me now tilted their heads in acknowledgement. A few even saluted, not for rank, but for recognition. Reports that had vanished were pulled back into circulation. My recommendations appeared on agendas where before they had been buried. And then came the appointment. Deputy Director of the Strategic Language and Cultural Intelligence Program. The office overlooked Fort Belvoir, windows tall enough to remind me every day that vantage points matter. I didn't throw a party. I didn't announce it. I stood alone in that room, my heels quiet against pale wood floors, and let the reality sink in. For the first time, I wasn't someone's daughter standing in the corner. I was the one at the head of the table, the one shaping policy, teaching officers that language is more than translation. It is power, camouflage, confession. The first class I taught, I hung a map on the wall. Not the political one everyone knows, with neat borders and colored blocks, but a dialect grid of China, dotted with red pins. In the far left corner, a small cluster marked the mountains of Yunnan. I said nothing. I let them see it. Because that corner, once dismissed as irrelevant, had rewritten the balance in a room full of generals. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it doesn't even speak. It stands quietly, holding proof no one can ignore, and waits for the room to shift. That was my revenge. Not an explosion, not a breakdown, but a realignment so sharp it left no doubt who now carried the voice. When I think of him now, I don't imagine the general who silenced me. I picture the man signing his resignation, pen trembling slightly against the page. I remember the single word he finally gave the panel, no, and how it weighed more than any command he had ever issued. In that moment, the silence belonged to me. I walk forward differently now. Not louder, not softer, but certain. Certain that the corner he tried to trap me in became my vantage point. Certain that the legacy he tried to erase has become the foundation I now own. And certain that justice, when it comes, doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it walks in quietly, cold and deliberate, and takes the seat at the table that was always meant for you. Justice didn't come to me in a roar. It arrived quietly, like the slow fall of dust after a building collapses, coating everything with proof of what once stood and can never be rebuilt. My father built his fortress out of silence, believing control would outlast truth. But in the end, it was silence that undid him. My silence, sharpened, disciplined, patient enough to strike when the world was forced to listen. That's what I carried with me through every erased report, every buried commendation, every moment he tried to lock me in a corner. I didn't raise my voice. I raised my standard. And in the aftermath, I discovered something worth more than vindication: clarity. There's a lesson in this, one that extends beyond my story. Sometimes revenge isn't about fire or fury. Sometimes it's about waiting with discipline, letting the silence build until it becomes undeniable. Preparation, patience, and proof. That's how you shift the room without ever shouting. And maybe that's what justice really is. Not the noise of victory, but the stillness of truth standing where lies once lived. So I'll leave you with a question only you can answer. When betrayal comes, when someone tries to erase you, do you waste your strength fighting their shadow, or do you hold the silence until it breaks them? If this story found you, stay with me here. Subscribe, not because I ask, but because you know there are more truths buried in corners waiting to be unearthed. Together, we'll keep listening for the silences others dismiss and learn how to turn them into power. Thank you for letting my story reach your heart. Thank you for recognizing what most try to silence. The truth only matters when someone like you listens.